everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for a panel on alternative seafood as an ocean policy priority. We're really happy to have you with us. My name is Danielle Wiener-Bronner. I'm a writer with CNN Business, and I will be moderating today. We have some really great panelists with us today. We have Vanessa Benjamin, who is a New Harvest Fellow and a student at Newcastle University. We have Jason Scorse. He wears many hats at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. He's an associate professor, program chair of the Program Chair International Environmental Policy, and the director of the Center for the Blue Economy. We also have Shannon Cosentino-Roush, Chief Strategy Officer for Finless Foods, and Carrie Chan, co-founder and CEO of Avant Meats. Just a few guidelines for today. Just want to let you know what to expect. We will have a panel discussion with all of the speakers. We will have an audience Q&A. You can go ahead and start putting those questions into the chat right now, or you can wait towards the end. And then we'll have some closing remarks. So just a reminder for everyone, please be present, be engaged. We're really excited to be here with you today. And please be respectful when you comment. I'm sure you all will. And yes, please remember, if you have any questions, put them in the chat. Even if we don't get to them, we will see them. So please go ahead and put those in there. I think we'll ask all of our participants to turn their cameras on at this point so we can all be here together. Vanessa, we still can't see you. At least I can't. Well, why don't we go ahead and get started? I would love it if everybody could just introduce themselves, let us know a little bit about you, who you are, and what you do. Shannon, why don't you kick us off?
Sure, thanks, Danielle. Hi, I'm Shannon Cosentino-Roush, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Finless Foods. Just for new folks, Finless Foods is an alternative seafood company that's based in the Bay Area, California. We're working to produce both plant-based and cell-cultured tuna, with cell-cultured bluefin tuna being our first product to market. I'm so excited to have this conversation today. It's something I've been advocating for a long time, to talk about alternative seafood as an ocean policy priority. I guess just to tell a little bit about myself and so my relevant background, I've worked in international ocean policy, mainly actually international fisheries, for most of my career. And I've been lucky to wear actually many hats, everything from working in the US government to working with the UN and with NGOs and the seafood sector. So I've worn many hats, and I think that's given me a lot of perspective on various stakeholders, sort of what drives them, the motivators, and I'm happy to bring some of that experience to the table today. So welcome, and welcome to all for joining us, and welcome to the panelists.
Great. Thank you. Jason, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. So yeah, good to be here, everybody. As Danielle mentioned, I direct the Center for the Blue Economy, and we work on a lot of issues related to kind of the new blue economy sectors that are developing, a lot of them related to kind of climate change impacts, and clearly alternative seafood is going to be a really, I hope, a big piece of the puzzle for kind of marine conservation and some economic development in some new and interesting ways. So I look forward to the discussion.
Great. Carrie, you're up.
Hi, everyone. Carrie here, founder and CEO of Avant. We are the very first cultivated fish company of Asia. We currently operate in both Singapore and Hong Kong. We focus on the species that is commercially interested and valuable in this part of the world. In particular, some of the species that has driven the catching of these species from the ocean has driven to these species to be endangered, for example, and very focusing on the Asian market preferences in terms of seafood. Nice to meet everyone.
Thank you for being here. And Vanessa, please go ahead.
Hello to all participants and panelists, and thank you to the organizers for this opportunity. I'm a marine biologist, and I've worked in the conservation field in the Bahamas and wider Caribbean for the past 23 years. I've held leadership roles within nonprofits advancing science to guide policy, protected area management, and fisheries management. I've also worked within the tourism sector, creating conservation and sustainability programming within academia and, of course, the government. My past research studied the movement of bonefish, which is a multi-million-dollar industry for the Bahamas. This research identified important spawning habitats and migration corridors needed for protection. Since then, I've crossed over to the molecular world, but with the same passion to protect marine species, people's livelihoods, and their access to food. I'm a student at Newcastle University, a New Harvest Fellow, and my current research is entitled Laying the Groundwork for Molluscan Cellular Agriculture. It's a pleasure to be here participating in today's conversation.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for being here. I think it would be nice if we could just kick off with, a little setting the stage for us here. We're here to talk about alternative seafood and ocean policy. Why even have a conversation about alternative seafood in this context? Shannon, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, sure. Although I'm sure Jason has a lot to contribute here too. I think it's really important because right now I think everyone's following sort of where we are in the climate crisis and the new priority of looking at the ocean in terms of climate, sort of what it can do for us in terms of mitigating climate change, but also the impacts of climate on the ocean. And in a lot of ways, fisheries have been at the center of that conversation in terms of climate change effects to fisheries and climate resilient fisheries. But there hasn't been much conversation around the role of alternatives in that space, both to mitigate climate change, but also in terms of helping us have a climate resilient seafood supply chain. So the role of alternatives in the face of some of the challenges we'll face in fisheries. So I think it's just something that's been a bit of a missed opportunity, or it's been kind of sliding under the radar. And I think it's important to sort of increase its prominence in starting with conversation, but hopefully that will track into setting it as a policy priority moving forward. So I'm sure folks have a lot of great things to add, but that's, I think, from an umbrella standpoint, sort of my perspective.
Mm-hmm. Jason, what do you think?
Yeah, so I would add to what Shannon says. I mean, my view, kind of both from a researcher and academic, is that there's really very little sustainable seafood in the world. And I know this will be a controversial statement to a lot of the colleagues I work with, but I really think a lot of stuff that gets considered sustainable is not truly sustainable. And it's for three reasons. One is people admit this. There's this endemic mislabeling of fish. They call it imposter fish in the seafood supply chain. So you can have all the criteria in the world, but if half the fish is mislabeled intentionally to make unsustainable labeled as sustainable, low value as high value, so this is fraud, this is not errors, the whole entire supply chain is unstable. Second, even the organizations that I work with and I like, from Marine Stewardship Council to Seafood Watch, their criteria has a lot of holes in it. I'm going to be real honest. The things that they consider sustainable often are not. To give you an example, in Monterey Bay here, things that are considered, relatively sustainable, they're still throwing thousands of seal bombs into the water, creating huge marine acoustic impacts, disrupting whales and wildlife. It's stuff you would never consider sustainable, but somehow it doesn't get under their umbrella. And then third, and most of you all know this, there's just so much that goes unseen. There's so much marine biodiversity impacts there that just never gets reported because we don't have observer coverage on these fleets. And then we can add in the slavery and the human rights abuses. So the industrial seafood supply chain is a hot mess. And I really look at alternative seafood as something to really displace this in a significant way so that we can get true sustainability, which I just don't think we're even anywhere scratching the surface of right now.
Yeah, I think it would be great, Vanessa, to hear from you, particularly about this idea of conservation and the kind of ecosystem that exists that the alternative seafood sector could help protect.
Yeah, and that's the perspective that I looked at this from. Our oceans are threatened, let's be honest. And I can't help ask the question, well, what does this mean for small island developing states and developing countries. I like to call them large ocean states, as I think they should appropriately be called, since the Bahamas' ocean territory is 48 times greater than our land area. But, you know, there are fishing dependent communities that are inextricably tied to the ocean as a source of food and livelihood. And then when we look at the climate change predictions for the Caribbean, warmer waters will result in shifting fish patterns, and scientists predict fish will move to deeper waters, making them difficult to access. And some will move from the tropics northward. Alternative proteins matter because they can serve as another tool in the conservation toolbox. And similar to how we look at marine protected areas, effective fisheries management tools, and habitat restoration, and they've been highlighted as pathways to more resilient fisheries, alternative seafood, specifically cell-cultured seafood, has this very same potential.
Carrie, I think in the markets where your company operates, we are further along in terms of these products being seafood, something that you could eat at your own table and not something that is still kind of a foreign idea. So I am very curious from your perspective whether there have been particular policy initiatives that have helped get to that place, and you know, how you're able to bring this to market.
Yeah, so I think in terms of the policy, I think we would in terms of seafood, there are actually quite a bit of challenges, because I think among the different kind of meat type, beef is considered one of the major greenhouse gas emissions. So the impact of that is very very clear and direct. The cause and effect relationship is very clear. Where we operate a lot of the time, because fish and ocean is actually quite far away from our daily life, and the direct relationship is not really that like that easily quantifiable in the case of seafood. I would have to say that it has been one of the challenge that is what we are facing in terms of presenting it as a solution from the investor angle. Some of them, they will look at, okay, do you reduce the carbon footprint? Do you reduce? But then of course we know that the ocean is producing close to half of the oxygen for the planet. And although it's produced by plankton, but fish being a very major part of the cycle to complete the biocycle, is actually very important. But this cause and result kind of relationship is not that clear. So I would say that the policy mostly benefiting from the overall policy of supporting innovation in alternative protein, not so much very specifically in the seafood, which I hopefully from our discussion here can actually point to some of the direction where advocacy and all of the peers in this industry can pull together to promote a bit more for seafood in particular.
Yeah, I'm interested, Shannon, you mentioned this a little bit earlier, that you think that there's, an opportunity that maybe is being missed right now. It sounds like, Carrie, from what you're saying, for investors, there's a focus on innovation, but maybe not a complete understanding of what the environmental impacts are. So I'm curious, Shannon and others, in your conversations about alternative seafoods, what are the questions that you get that you think, that there could be more clarity around? And what do you say to people when they say, why is this important? Why should we care about this?
Yeah, I think there's the obvious questions that we get all the time. I'm sure Carrie will feel the same. I mean, I think first and foremost, we get asked about labeling, but I think that's more of a technical question. And so related to this, I think the second question we get asked all the time is sort of, what kind of data do you have around the impact potential of alternative seafood? Have you done LCAs related to plant or cell cultured? How does that compare to the conventional seafood supply chain? What are those data points? And so I think any efforts to kind of provide more information here would be helpful. I think within the industry, but also within academia, within sort of civil society groups, because it's a really complex thing to map out. There's not a ton of data around the impact of the conventional seafood industry. I think we know that, tuna, for example, is caught thousands and thousands of miles away and kind of transported to us. And we know that there is a lot of bycatch and things like that from the conventional seafood industry. But there's not sort of like a number, a data point you can point to and say, wild caught tuna fisheries impact holistically are X, whether that's emissions or, biodiversity impact, and alternative seafoods impacts are Y, so that there can be sort of a one-to-one comparison. I'm not sure it's such a complex seafood supply chain, which I think everyone on this call knows. So I'm not pretending that we'll be able to get it to as simple as an X versus Y. But I think gleaning any more information we can to point to say, this is why there is really positive potential in making impact from alternative seafood will only help make the case more, especially to policymakers and investors looking to sort of create a space for this industry and scale it up.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like it would be helpful to have a little bit more of, some type of infrastructure where, there's a way to make an apples to apples comparison instead of trying to kind of approximate what the impact could be.
Yeah, and I don't know if we'll get to apples, but I think even apples to oranges or apples to bananas is closer to what we have in the fruit category. Sounds great.
Yeah. I did want to go back to, Jason, one area that you've been interested in, which is the relationship between ocean health and climate. And I'm curious, I know climate is, of course, top of mind for all of us. Can you kind of draw the connection between alternative seafood and climate, like why investing in alternative seafood could be considered a climate priority as well?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the first, as Shannon's kind of alluded to, there's a huge kind of climate footprint from just these international fleets, right? It's just, first of all, as we know, ships and these big ships, it's the dirtiest fuel on the planet. Dirty is really the scraping the bottom of the barrel, literally. Then you got the huge distances. Then you get the refrigeration. Then for a lot of fish, especially the stuff that ends up in, fast food restaurants, fish sticks, a lot of times this stuff goes back and forth across the ocean for processing plants and stuff. So, when you add up the full life cycle of a lot of global fish, and for the US, we import about 85%, it's a pretty huge carbon impact. And then you also add that with warming waters and ocean acidification, all these species are starting to move in all types of unpredictable ways. And so you have really big disruptions in supply chains and livelihoods. And so the plant and cell-based world, which can be located in physical locations that are set and give stability and give jobs, I think, to places that typically you don't associate with the ocean sector, right? Because you could think of, for the United States, the industrial heartland could be big brewery, companies, doing the cell-based lines and then, shipping it out across the country. So I think there's a lot of potential on the economic development side, and that would really help the instability caused by climate change.
Yeah, another, I think, lens perhaps to look at this, and maybe Vanessa, you can speak to this, is, as a crisis that is not just environmental, but also human. It's an economic crisis and also a hunger problem. And I'd, be curious to hear how you think about that from policy perspective or otherwise in terms of approaching your research and also talking about it.
Yeah, so the reality of the situation is, especially in the Caribbean, specifically in the Bahamas, we have species that are already declining. And, it's heartbreaking to see headlines that say economically and culturally important species like conch, which is a marine mollusk, can disappear in 10 to 15 years if not properly managed. And, I can't help but to ask the question, can cell-cultured seafood production be used to produce conch meat for local consumption? And this ties right into climate change. It ties right into fisheries management. If you produce the conch meat for local consumption, let's say during coinciding with a multi-year moratorium on the capture of conch, can that be used to help restore local conch populations? I mean, I don't know, but it's worth a try. And keeping up with our changing climate on the local scale, this means that livelihoods will significantly be impacted. The type of fish we catch and the amount of fish we catch is going to change. So the question then is, can cell-cultured seafood production be used as a climate change adaptation tool, providing seafood to local economies, and if done right, supporting local livelihoods? I don't know the answer to that question, but it's certainly worth exploring and trying.
Yeah. And Carrie, when you spoke, you mentioned a little bit about, I think, issues similar to what Shannon was saying, kind of finding it hard to sort of measure and talk about the impact that you're having from the perspective of investors. Given that you're in an environment where it's a little bit further ahead than we are in terms of path to market, how important for you is support from the government in terms of policy, in terms of explaining this as an environmental issue, or for you, does it make more sense as as part of a private company to appeal to those investors and make the case to them?
Yeah, definitely. The policy, government, and on that layer is actually very, very important. In the cultivated meat space, I think one of the area is that the pre-market approval. In this case, I mean, for example, in US, it will be FDA. In other places, it could be the corresponding department. Depending on the country, the legal system, the enforcement kind of department, some places is actually simpler. For example, some other markets, it could be multiple departments, including agriculture and fishery department, and similar kind of FDA version, for example, in China, etc. The multiple department. And I think in those cases, the challenge will be coming from really different angles. For example, let's say we get the food safety approved, but then, on the trading, how do we get the code? Although we may not be importing, exporting. I mean, the question about labeling that Shannon mentioned briefly, labeling on the package. And if at the beginning we do produce at one location and need to move them around, ship to the regional kind of market, do we have the HS code even? And I think that will be something that we need, more than, in addition to food safety, pre-market approval, we may need more people in the industry actually supporting this and allowing this kind of thing to happen. Just pointing a few. Actually many different aspects would be very related to our distributions and, larger scale commercialization.
Jason, I'm curious your thoughts. You said that there are no types of sustainable seafood. Do you think there's room to work with the current fisheries industry, or do you think that should go away and be replaced potentially by alternative seafood?
Yeah, so let me be clear here. I think there are small amounts of what we would consider sustainable, but it's a very small minority. I'll just put my cards on the table. I hope alternative seafood displaces the entire industrial fishing fleet. Maybe we still have some recreational fishing, small scale stuff, but the industrial fishing fleet is basically ecocide and needs to be disrupted and put in the history books.
Wow, strong words. I'm wondering, if we could kind of zoom out a little bit, and if Vanessa, maybe you can kick us off. What is happening right now in terms of ocean health and conservation that you think is working and that makes you excited and that potentially has a place to include alternative seafood, or maybe already does? Vanessa, do you want to start off with that, or someone else can jump in?
Danielle, I didn't get your complete question. I think it's a connection issue. I only got bits and pieces.
No problem. I was just hoping you could kick us off with a discussion on what ocean policy you think is working right now, what's really exciting you and seems to be the way forward, and whether there could be or is a space already for alternative seafood in that.
Yeah, I think I caught pieces of that. So apologies if I don't answer your question directly. It's because I missed out. But what's exciting that's happening is in the space is this focus on ocean. It's obviously that the political, it's high on international political agenda, and that's good. But it's going to take more than that. And I would like to see alternative seafood integrated more into the conservation discussion, and more from the perspective of how do we use it as a practical tool? How do we take it beyond just these big concept ideas to more of on the ground action? So, I can see, similar to what Jason said, not only facilities in the US, but facilities in these small island nations that are going to be impacted so much by climate change, and addressing those issues and exploring them a little bit. And I think it's going to take collaborations across the sector, government, scientists, nonprofit, civil society, and then we can't forget fishers. They're just as much part of this as I think the consumer who wants to eat the fish.
Shannon, it looked like you maybe wanted to jump in. Was that right?
Oh, no, I could definitely jump in.
Oh, sure.
I definitely agree about, it's exciting that ocean is really being prioritized on the policy agenda, and that the ocean climate connection is kind of finally being made. But I agree with Vanessa that it's very much just a start, and high level policy commitments are great as sort of a indicator or a benchmark, but there needs to be a lot more done in terms of drilling that down into action. I think the sort of piece that alternative seafood really needs to be looped in there is, even at the highest level, being considered as a sustainable seafood alternative. I think, to Jason's point, there's an entire conversation around what is sustainable seafood. Like, depending on the different group, there's different definitions, but there's been sort of a penultimate question mark around, is alternative seafood seafood? Is alternative seafood part of the sustainable seafood movement? And so I think for alternative seafood to be kind of put to play as a solution to these high level policy priorities, there needs to be sort of the tone set that, yes, alternative seafood is sustainable seafood, should be included as such, and should be executed on to start finding actionable ways to make these ocean policy kind of commitments realized. Because I think right now, very traditional solutions that are important, I think, Vanessa, you said we kind of need an entire suite of tools in the toolbox, but very traditional tactics are being employed to meet these high level policy priorities. And I just think we've been doing them for 30, 40 years, and it's proven to not be sufficient. So we need to get creative. We need to add some more tools to the toolbox. I think innovation plays a huge role here, and alternative seafood specifically. So I think I agree with Vanessa, just drilling in a little bit more as to the role of alternative seafood as an actionable solution to meet those high level commitments.
Shannon, it's a good point. I think you make that to make this a larger movement. I'm paraphrasing, sorry if I'm getting it wrong, but you need to see alternative seafood as seafood, and that's one of the questions that's still out there. In terms of answering that question, do you think that it is about kind of a broader kind of step change in how most people think about seafood, or do you think that that's more of a technical kind of labeling thing that has to do with the USDA or the FDA that says this is seafood, this is part of this category, and that is what we need to get to that place where people think about it as like part of the same bucket?
Yeah, I think everyday consumers are more willing to already see it as alternative, as sustainable seafood. And that's why, a lot of these studies show that there's a high level of interest in trying these products and seeing this industry kind of come to life. And I think, to be honest, the question around what does the government need to do around ocean policy, and I mean sort of government in little g, because I think it doesn't just mean U.S. government, it even means at sort of the IGO, intergovernmental level. There needs to be more support from those levels to basically set the tone that alternative seafood is part of the suite of options under sustainable seafood, because I think a lot of the questions around does it fit or does it not in the movement come more from the policy levels, come more from civil society, and we've been a little I don't say myopic, but we've been stovepiping things. And so I think it's one of the ways the ocean policy community can kind of support this movement is to start folding in alternatives into their conversations and seeing it as part of the movement. Mm-hmm. And I think it's kind of to tap into what Carrie was saying. I think when we think of government support, our minds go to sort of regulatory approval, subsidies, tax incentives, things like that. But I actually think it doesn't have to be monetary. Even things like the US or any sort of the World Fish, et cetera, creating sort of buckets for domestic, production councils, or for food security initiatives or food resiliency initiatives. I think it's for them to include alternatives as part of those suites of tools that they're looking at.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious about concerns that policymakers or others may have with alternative seafood. Would just love to hear, from any of you. Maybe Vanessa, you can start, like what those concerns might be, how they can be addressed and mitigated, and maybe later we can also talk a little bit about on the commercial side the question of scale and expense, and how something like a cellular seafood product could be sold in grocery stores or in restaurants at a price point that will attract people. So sorry, I grouped those both in there, but if we could just start off with Vanessa about questions that might come to you from policymakers. This is open to everyone, so feel free to kick it over to someone else if you'd rather not, but I thought we could start off with you.
Yeah, some of the questions I think can come as, what is the role of alternative proteins and how we can integrate it into existing goals that we have. And I think that requires collaborative effort across many different disciplines, because I don't think it's going to just settle on one. And, governments can invest in alternative protein research and development. I mean, fishers can advocate for alternative proteins as a climate smart strategy. And philanthropists can continue to invest and support the work. It's my contribution to that. Hopefully I heard the question properly.
Yeah. Did anyone else want to jump in on that one?
I'll just jump in quickly. I think, again, the emphasis on small scale and local fishers is important. And I just want to kind of emphasize that the biggest threat to their livelihood is industrial fishing, right? Industrial fishing is what's decimating the oceans. And then they're the ones at the bottom of the food chain who get what's left over, and oftentimes very little. So I think anything that displaces the large scale industrial fishing industry will rebound and benefit more local, small scale. Now, I also want to be clear, local and small scale doesn't necessarily mean sustainable. There's been huge documented problems. In fact, sometimes on a per unit basis, the bycatch can be worse on small scale. But that being said, at least for protecting livelihoods, I think all of us have an interest in really reducing the industrial scale of fishing.
Yeah, just to continue on the question of scale, maybe Carrie, you can speak a little bit to the approach that your company may take to scaling up and to moderating price.
Yeah, sure. So we work with 3 species that is, consumed a lot in Asia. In particular, for example, one of the foods that, very craved by the, consumers has leading, the original species called bahaba has been kind of endangered because of this behavior. People just catch those fish for pile of the fish that is highly valued. So we try to work with different species. And interesting, among cultivated meat, I think fish is actually very interesting category because there are so many species that we can work with. So, and also then, continue can have different new products coming up. So I think that provide a lot of variety to actually catch the, the interest of consumers at the end. In terms of the scaling up, we see that, as what Shannon has mentioned, definitely we are developing a pilot plan, looking to have it up and running towards end of next year. So once solution is, established, one protocol established, that could be actually replicated in the other locations. And of course, for fish, again, we're talking about many species. So down the line, we can actually continue to develop other, fish species as a product. Compared to traditional aquaculture, where I understand that domestication of new species is actually from time to time quite challenging. So that's why we have only a certain species that can be domesticated and bred in a very large scale. But in this case, for cultivated fish, they're basically not that restriction. So I think that will help us to cater for the consumers that is demand for a variety of fish products compared to maybe pork, chicken is just one genetic. In a lot of cases as well. In this case, we can take care of that, a little bit easier with this technology.
Thank you. I see we have some questions coming in, so thank you for people who have been asking, and feel free to, if you haven't yet asked a question but you have one, please feel free to put it in the chat. I am going to just take a minute to read through these. Here's one from Russell Hall. He said, have there been any form of government funding for alt seafood? If so, which governments have been leaders on this issue? I'm going to open that up to everybody.
I can just speak real quick. It's pretty low from what I know. I know GFI is kind of monitoring these flows. I think Singapore is putting a little money in. Israel starting to put a little money in, and my group and others are, and I know GFI is really lobbying the federal government right now to put some in this new Build Back Better plan. We'd love, even hundreds of millions, a couple billion, which these days is small change, but could really jumpstart basic research. And that's where I think it really needs to go, really at the basic research phase. And again, a couple $1 billion could just really revolutionize and really kickstart a lot of these cell lines.
And I don't know, Carrie, if you know more in terms of the Asia context, but I don't think that there's been any funding that's earmarked just for alt seafood versus sort of cell ag maybe more broadly. I know Singapore has been sort of leading the way in creating a pot of funding for cell ag more broadly, but I don't think there was any specific earmark for seafood. But I may be wrong.
Our experience is exactly, no specific. It varies from agency to agency. So actually, some agency focusing on fishery, they actually have some funding for, people in the industry to create with new innovation, be it aquaculture, be it other ways. But, alternative seafood in particular, there's no specific bracket for that. Unfortunately, it's definitely a way to go. I would actually compare that, in some of the cases, some government, including the government, I think in multiple places, they will have the matching fund. So some VC, they will invest, in a certain kind of sector. The government will basically match the fund for those that has selected as some of the, investments. And, generally it's very broad overall, not specified into seafood or not even like alternative and cultivated seafood. Most of the cases, that's why going back to the point at the beginning, most of the time, some of this fund allocation, they may actually look at the ESG performance to do the fund allocation. So when we cannot give them a very big numbers, I mean, there is actually some numbers, for example, carbon, emission from the fleet, from the fish farm is actually quantifiable, but then say, hey, this is comparatively less than beef, right? And then they will measure the effect. Okay, if I invest in a, for example, beef company or something like that, they'll say, okay, I can hit, that KPI a bit more. And so that actually make the thing a little bit challenging from the angle in terms of, allocating funds, private money, investment money, something like that along that line. Even in the case where they have the, support for innovation overall, there's no specific kind of dedicated to only seafood, alternative seafood. So yeah, definitely it will be something very helpful if we have something like that.
I have another, thank you, Carrie. I have another question here from Megan. She says, a recent study published in Fish and Fisheries contends that cellular seafood is confronting a long and narrow path with many obstacles for it to become a replacement to conventional seafood and benefit the ocean ecologically. This finding may be influencing some in the sustainable seafood field from working to advance cell-based seafood. Any thoughts on the study or on that perspective from the panel?
I'll jump in if anyone, or Shannon, go for it.
No, I was pausing to let someone else jump in first as well. So go for it, Jason.
Okay. Yeah, I think what people are misreading in this space is, look, this is, I think, alt seafood, especially the cell-based stuff, is where solar was 25 years ago. Okay. And if you look at projections of what the prices of solar back then, they were way, way off. They were way higher than they ended up being, right? So I think if you're thinking about it right now, current prices, current technology, it looks daunting. How is this going to scale up and displace, millions of metric tons? But look at the levels of technology we're going. If it gets funding, I think it's going to follow the same trajectory as solar and wind. These prices have plummeted 90, 95%. I mean, people don't realize, but renewable power is cheaper than fossil fuels in 2/3 of the world right now without subsidies. Right. So I think that's the way we need to think of alternative seafood. We're in the beginning of a multi-decade thing. So if you think out 20 years, I think you could have tuna steaks grown in breweries that are cheaper than the stuff here. But you have to think kind of Moore's law and exponential growth. The other part I just mentioned is we've really been focusing on cell-based, but I think the plant-based stuff is really, really promising. And there's a lot of stuff that is on market now that's great and cost competitive. So if you break that part of it out too, I think is important.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's important to mention as well is I think that framing is solely based on there being impact if there's a replacement. And I think the thing we sort of talked about in touching, but we haven't really talked about in depth yet, is that the seafood, the projected demand for seafood is only continuing to rise. And if you look at the projections in the next decade, they're also continuing to rise. And yet what we've been able to take out of the ocean sustainably is leveling off. And so there's just this gap between the seafood we demand and the seafood we can sustainably take out of the ocean. And yes, we have aquaculture, but not all species are well suited for aquaculture. For example, tuna has been very difficult to aquaculture successfully at scale. Not to mention the feed conversion ratios are really high. So then it's causing, other issues down the pipe, like, the mass pressure on forage fish to then feed these species in aquaculture. So there's no silver bullet here into how we're going to sort of meet that gap between demand and supply. And I think that's something that is hard to project and hard to touch on in this study to say, is impact only going to come from replacement? Or is this going to be a space that can help provide another source of supply so that we don't have pressure to fish harder? Because we've seen what's happened to the tuna fisheries in the last decades from the pressure to fish harder. And I don't think we can continue to fish them harder and have them, exist into the future for other generations. So I think we have some hard choices ahead. And while there's no silver bullet, like Jason is also saying, we also can't sort of stifle innovation when it's just getting off the ground before it has its chance to spread its wings and reach its full potential. And I think there's this caution in looking at innovation to say, well, if we don't have all the metrics like Carrie's saying, and if we don't have an exact nail down formula to say how this is going to replace and offset current demand, and that's the only way it'll have positive impact, then I think we're doing ourselves a disservice, because really we need multiple moonshots and ocean shots to sort of meet the planet's mandate in the time that we've been given. And I often say this, and maybe it's a little controversial, but I think international climate change negotiations is equally a moonshot, and it's going to take a lot of political will. And so I think this space isn't any less than that. And so I really respect the study, and I talked to UCSB and the authors a lot about it, but I think that there's so many unknowns, I would hesitate us to make or break our investment in this space solely based on one early study.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon, for that. I think that's a really good way of looking at this issue. And thank you for that question. I see another one here that actually touches a little bit on this idea of the growing demand for seafood. It's from Paul. It says, the LED paradox showed us that increasingly efficient lighting perversely led to increased use of lighting. Is there a danger of an analog scenario here? Might cultivated seafood lead to overall increased consumption of seafood? This one is directed to Jason, I believe, but Jason, after you respond, would love to hear anybody else's thoughts.
Yeah, sure. This is kind of in economics, the rebound effect, right? I'm not too worried about it because, I mean, again, if you have cell-based or plant-based that's clean and free of heavy metals and sustainable, if people eat more of it, it's a great source of protein and nutrients, right? We know, again, clean fish is great omegas and it has a lot of nutrients. And so I'm not that worried about it. Again, I'm not a nutritionist or anything, but I think of all the things we have to be concerned about, people moving to really clean proteins that are grown in a sustainable way, and that's a greater share of their diet. Especially if it's displacing other forms of unsustainable food, I mean, I think that would probably be a net plus.
Did any? Oh, Shannon, go ahead.
I was going to say,
Danielle?
Carrie. Oh yeah, chime in, Vanessa.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to provide food, period. I think that's something that we need to look at. And I can't, help but stress the scale that we're looking at this. You can look at it from the global scale, but we need to look at it from the small island nation scale and these prediction and ocean patterns. And what does that mean? We're talking about artisanal fishing and small scale fishing. And what does that mean for that sector and these fishing dependent communities? I just think we need to always keep that in the back of our minds because it's a reality.
And I think along those lines, Vanessa, it's a great point, is just the food security and food resilience conversation broadly, because as we saw even in COVID, we have really internationally complex supply chains right now. And the power of cell ag is also the ability to produce any species in sort of a geographically agnostic way. So whether it's in a big ocean island state, or if it's in sort of Kansas, et cetera, or, Asia, where they're transiting species from the North Atlantic, I don't know. It has tremendous potential in terms of resiliency and food security. And I think that's why you're seeing increasingly intergovernmentals interested in exploring the space around that sort of topic area.
Great. I see one more question that I'll squeeze in from Mukunda. Do you include freshwater fish in a basket of seafood? I think it can be. I know I've worked on food security projects around fisheries that were all freshwater oriented, and this technology can apply equally to producing freshwater species. So I think we can look at seafood as a broader category to include freshwater species as well. But that's just an opinion. I don't know, Jason or Carrie, if you all agree or have different opinions.
Yeah, definitely. So, some of the, ecosystem are, surrounding rivers. Actually, a lot of freshwater fish in this part of the world as well. So definitely they also need to be, I don't know whether you remember there's a news talking about one of the major rivers of China is actually trending towards no fish, basically not enough, population to replenish. I think definitely also need the same kind of protection or the conservation kind of, policy to protect even freshwater fish.
Thank you so much to everyone on the panel and to everyone who joined us today. Thank you for being so engaged and for your questions. I think we have about 2 minutes left. So if there are any other last minute questions, you can drop them in the chat. And if not, I will say thank you to everybody. And if any of our panelists have any last minute thoughts they'd like to jump in and share right now, this is the time.
I guess just I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation and have, upward of 150 people attend, because I think it's something that Jason, Carrie, Vanessa, and I we can have this conversation, and we can go to government centers and kind of knock on doors. But I think it's going to take a number of people having this conversation and knocking on doors to see progress to move in the alternative space, whether it's cell or plant or fermentation, et cetera. And so I appreciate everyone coming and having this conversation, and I appreciate everyone's thought-provoking questions, because I think it's going to take all of us for this to really become an ocean policy or even a food policy priority. So I encourage everyone to follow this topic and advocate accordingly.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us again. I hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference and the rest of your Friday.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.